Welcome to the hands-on session on functions. In this video, we'll see how functions can be defined and how to call the defined functions. Now let's see how a function can be defined in Python. So always a function in Python starts with the keyword def and it should be followed by the function name. And here in this example, I would like to give the function name as fun. And I do not want to give any parameters to this function. So I'm using the empty parenthesis indicating that there is no parameter that is received by this function. And this parenthesis should be followed by this colon. And the first line of the function, as we already discussed, it's called as a function header. So which constitutes the def keyword followed by the function name, and if there are any parameters, that parameters are to be provided within this parenthesis followed by a colon. And this function header tells you the function name and the parameters that are received by this function. And assume these two are the statements that are part of the function. So this constitutes the body of the function, and when you call this function, these statements would be executed. And when you observe all the statements that are part of the function, they should follow some indentation. Function header and the function body should be with the different indentations, and all the statements that are part of the function body, they should follow the uniform indentation unless there are any control structures. So now the function is ready for us and we can call this function to execute. Even if you execute this function, so nothing will happen because you are not calling the function, just the function is defined. So to make the function executed, what you need to do is you need to call this function as part of your code. Now let's assume these are the set of statements. So where I would like to call this function, and this function can be called with the name followed by an empty parenthesis. As there are no parameters, you need not to pass any arguments while calling the function. So here this statement indicates the function call. So fun is a function name and there are no parameters, so I am calling this function using this statement. You can have this function call as part of the Python code. So now let's save it and let's execute this code. So how this code executes, we'll see. So you can observe the statements. Here first the welcome to Python statement would be executed. Then after that, so this statement, print code before the function call, that is executed. Then after that the function fun would be called, and there are two different statements, and those statements both are the print statements. So just to make it simple, we use the print statements. Actually you can have any other set of statements also, and then those two statements of the function would be executed, and after execution of these statements then the control will be reverted back. So this statement that is placed after the function call would be executed. So you can see that here. So this is how a function can be defined and the function can be called. Here if you observe, this part of the code is known as the function definition, as you are defining a function. So this part of the code is known as the function definition. And here you are calling the code to execute this function. The function is already defined and you can call this function so that the function would be executed. So this is called as a function call and this is known as a function definition. So consider the same function fun and we will update this function such that it will receive some parameters. Let's add a single parameter. So the parameter name is n, so which is a parameter that is received by the function during the function call. So this parameter indicates that when you call this function fun, you need to pass values to these parameters. And now let's design the body of this function. So now assume these three are the statements that are part of the function. So like we are displaying the value of the parameter n, and then we are computing the square of n, and then we are displaying the square of that n, and this constitutes the body of the function. So now let's call this function. So assume here we are calling this function fun. You cannot use the same function call that used for the earlier function because this function is receiving a parameter, so that you need to send a value while calling this function fun. So let's assume I'm going to pass the value 5 to this function. So now let's try to execute this code. So if you observe the output of the function, you can understand that first the code that is placed before the function call would be executed. Then the code that is part of the function would be executed so that you are getting the value of n, and after that you are getting the square of n. And once that is done, the function execution is over, then the remaining part of the code that is placed after the function call would be executed. Thereby you are getting this statement displayed. That is how you can define functions with parameters, and the functions with parameters can be called by passing the values to the parameters during the function call. Now we understand how a function can be defined with parameters. We have seen how to define a function with single parameter. Now let's see how we can define a function with multiple parameters. So consider this function with the name product. and it is receiving two parameters. The m comma n are the parameters that can be received by this function, and you are just computing the product of these two parameters m and n and storing that in the variable p, and you are displaying that value of the product of m and n as part of the function. So, and now let us see how this function can be called. So, while calling the function, you need to ensure that, so as the function is defined with two parameters, you need to send two different values. So, here in this case, the function product can be called by passing two different values, as the function is defined with two different parameters. So, here in this case, we are passing 5, 7 as two different values to the function product, so that those values will be copied to these parameters m and n, and the function body would be executed whenever this function product is called. Now let us execute this function and see. So here if you observe, your code execution starts here. As this is the comment in Python, so this statement would be ignored by Python interpreter, and then this statement would be executed. As a result, you are getting this message, code before function call. So here you are calling the function product by passing two different values, and the values you are sending will be copied to m and n. That's how m gets the value 5 and n gets the value 7. And here you are displaying the values of m and n. You can see 5 and 7 are displayed, and then after that you are computing the product of 5 and 7, and that is stored in p, and that value is displayed in this statement, so that you are getting the product of 5 and 7, that is 35. And later, after completion of execution of this function, so the control will be reverted back to the statement after the function call, and then the statement would be executed. So that is how the functions with parameters would be executed. So you can define the function with multiple parameters. You can call the function with the multiple parameters. So far we have seen how to define a function and how the function can be called, and during the function call how we can pass the parameters to the function. So now let's see when there are multiple functions that are defined and how do we call them. So let's assume sum is a function which receives two parameters and which displays the sum of those two numbers, whereas product is another function defined with two parameters again, and this function displays the product of those two numbers that are received as parameters. Now let's see how these functions can be called. Here you can see this function called sum. By passing two arguments to this function sum, this function can be called. When this statement executes, so this function would be called, and the statements that are part of this function would be executed. And similarly, this statement, which is a function call, calls the function product by passing two different parameters, and inside this function we are computing the product of the two numbers that are received as parameters. So that is how we can have multiple functions as part of the code. One of the major advantages of functions is reusability. That is, once the function is defined, it is possible to reuse the code again and again. So consider this function sum, which is defined to add two different numbers. Once the function is defined, so it can be called, and when you call this function, you are passing two integer numbers. Now let's execute and see the result. When you execute this code snippet, then the function is called and it is returning the sum of two numbers that you are passing as parameters, that is 10 and 20, and the sum of the two numbers 10 and 20 is displayed as a result. So that is how you are calling this function. So now let's see how we can call this function multiple times. So let's call this function again by passing different set of parameters. So now I'm calling this function sum by passing 100 and 200 as parameters. So here I'm calling this function sum by passing 10, 20 as a parameters, and here in this function call I'm calling the same function sum by passing different set of parameters. So let's execute this code and see. So when you call this function for the first time, then the parameters are 10, 20. So the sum function is calculating the sum of 10 and 20 and it displaying the result. And similarly, when the function is called with the parameters 100 and 200, then the sum of those two numbers is computed and the value is displayed. So you can call the same function with floating point values also without making any difference. So now let's save it and execute this code. So you can observe here, you are calling the same function sum by passing two different sets of integer parameters, and you are calling the same function by passing two floating point numbers also. And maybe you can call the same function by passing one integer value and the other one as the floating point value also. So here you need not to bother about the type of parameters. So that flexibility is given by Python functions. So the same function can be called by passing two different strings also. Let's pass two different strings. So here if you observe, I'm calling the same function sum by passing two different strings. And when you observe the function definition, so I did not make any changes. So let's execute this code and see. The function is called integer values with float values, with integer and float values, with two strings also. So that is how the same function can be reused. Now I hope you understand so how a function can be called, passing different parameters, and how to define the functions with parameters and how to call the functions with different sets of parameters. Thank you for watching this video.